My name is Ray McAllister. I'm the Senior Director of Gossip and Rumors for the CropLife America. It's my privilege this morning to introduce Margaret O'Gorman, who is the President of the Wildlife Habitat Council. She operates at the intersection of business and nature. As President of the Wildlife Habitat Council, she helps companies find value in natural resources conservation and in mainstreaming biodiversity across their operations. She consults with multinational corporations to develop integrated strategies to implement conservation projects that meet business needs. And in so doing, they enhance ecosystems, connect communities, and engage employees. Margaret.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you to NAPPC for inviting me to talk to you today, and congratulations on your 19th conference. That is some great achievement. So my presentation today, I do not have any graphs. I do not have any footnotes. I do not have anything that can vaguely resemble anything academic. So we'll just take a little detour into my world, which is how to engage business in biodiversity action. So you guys are all pollinator experts in this room, so I'm going to talk about a bird. This is a piping plover chick. Piping plovers, as many of you will know, is a federally endangered species in the US. There's two main populations of piping plovers, one that migrates up and down the Atlantic seacoast, and one that migrates up and down to breed at the Great Lakes. On the Great Lakes, on Lake Michigan, we have the Indiana Dunes newly designated National Park. Right next to that, we have ArcelorMittal steel plant. Right next to that, we have the Gary Works. Next to that, we have the Hammond oil refinery. This is a landscape that is intensely industrial. Current industry and past industry are sitting in this immaculate, what was once an immaculate landscape of the Calumet region. So the piping plover nests on beaches. And it nests on beaches in such a great way that its eggs are camouflaged so well that you cannot see them when they nest. Biologists go out and try to seek them in the spring and mark them so people won't walk over them. So the piping plovers, when they lay their eggs in the spring before Memorial Day. And of course, we all know what Memorial Day causes in this country. It causes the beaches suddenly to become packed with people and with pets. And this is no different in the Indiana Dunes National Park, which is one of the most favorite recreation areas for the residents of the greater Chicago land area. So piping plovers trying to nest and trying to bring up their young on the beaches of Lake Michigan are very much challenged by people. So when we think about habitat, and this is what I want people to think about, we go first sometimes to protected places like national parks. But this little piping plover chick actually has better habitat on the neighboring steel mill property than it does on the protected park. For one simple reason, there are no people there. So in the Indiana Dunes area, the ArcelorMittal steel plant has restored 40 acres of prime Lake Michigan beachfront property. This 40 acres, a couple of years ago, was covered in 40-foot-high piles of slag. Slag is a byproduct of the steelmaking industry. This steel plant makes steel for the car industry, it makes steel for construction, it makes steel for a variety of things. It's a huge plant. But they decided to take back 40 acres and restore it. And I was there a couple of years ago, and you standing there with the national park on your right and this industrial landscape on your left, you could really see how this place could cause piping plovers to come back. They've had killdeer nesting there. There were pollinators actually buzzing in the air. There was an American kestrel hovering above the scene. And right behind me, there was a steel mill looking exactly what you think a steel mill would look like, with molten ore, with, you know, big machines and everything. So it's just a way of thinking about things differently, looking at the lands in different ways, and looking at corporate lands, industrial, post-industrial, in kind of just peeking around the corner at it and looking at it in a slightly different way that can really help to think about the contribution that corporate lands can make to biodiversity and certainly to pollinators. So what I wanted to talk about today was kind of how to do it. And there is a how to do it. There's a way of approaching the corporate sector that can engage them in pragmatic, and I mean pragmatic, boots on the ground, plants in the earth, people out in the landscape helping to make this happen, pragmatic ways of doing the work. And the one way to do it, the first way to do it is, first of all, recognize that business is in business to do business. They're not in business to do biodiversity. So the majority of ways that we interact with the corporate world is through arm's length philanthropic contributions. They give us $1 million. I wish they gave us $1 million. We go off and we buy land somewhere. They bring their employees out. We provide a cleanup. But when we talk to companies within a business scenario, what are you trying to achieve, and how can we use biodiversity action, conservation action, ecological restoration action to help you achieve a business need? Then the activity becomes integrated. It becomes part of what the business is doing. It becomes so-called mainstreamed into its operations. So we've identified 16 reasons that businesses can do biodiversity and get value out of them. One, of course, is a biodiversity impact for those industries that have a direct impact on the planet, those industries that dig the big holes to take out the materials that make the stuff that we all love, like our phones. The extractive industries, they have a direct biodiversity impact, so they will use biodiversity to address that. But by and large, the most common reasons that businesses do conservation are in social license to operate and employee engagement. Social license to operate is a concept of how a facility is a welcome member of a community. So back in the 1950s, a company would come in, set up its belching towers of pollution and just not care what a community says. That spawned the environmental justice movement, as we know. But today, companies are very aware of being community members and invest a lot of time and effort in securing their social license to operate. A social license to operate is not given by a regulatory agency. It's not given by a federal government, a state government, or a local government. It's given by the people in the community. So companies use their conservation work to secure their social license to operate. A company that is doing, for example, waste management, pollinator programs on their landfills and bringing the community in to support it and exporting their efforts into the community are securing their social license to operate. And employee engagement is the other one. You know, the human dimension at work is very important to companies. And most employees cannot touch a company's sustainability goals. They can't impact how energy is purchased, how water is managed, how materials are recycled. But every employee can actually put their hands on a biodiversity project. So those two are really important. So the first thing to remember with companies is identify the business reason for them to do conservation. And the next one is integrated into something that they're already doing. So the logos on this screen are the members of the Wildlife Habitat Council. We work with everybody from the extractive industries through the processing, manufacturing, distribution, energy, and then right to the end where we're putting it back into the ground in a landfill. So we work across what's called the value chain or the supply chain. Most industries right today are engaged in greening their supply chains, in enhancing how their supply chains are having a positive impact on the world. So, for example, there's a Suppliers Partnership for the Environment, which is an auto industry supply chain group driven by Fiat Chrysler, General Motors, Toyota, and really making their suppliers think about their human rights, the way they manage their materials, et cetera, but they've also embraced a biodiversity aspect to the work. So we've got big automakers basically saying to their producers, their vendors, how can you do conservation? How can you do ecological restoration as part of your supplier portfolio for our company? And they started with pollinators. They started with saying to these companies, please engage in a pollinator project, because many of these companies don't have very large facilities. They actually maybe just have a manufacturing facility with one of those lawns that we see everywhere. And what surprised the Suppliers Partnership for the Environment was, of all the kind of tech geeky aspects of, battery storage and waste disposal that all these engineers get involved with, the most popular part of the Suppliers Partnership for the Environment is actually the biodiversity aspect of it, because it's different, I think, because people get engaged with it. So when you work with companies, what are they doing? What are they trying to do in terms of their corporate citizenship, in terms of them trying to be better players in this crazy world that we live in today? And the other one is DTE. DTE is a utility in Detroit, and DTE has basically said to its vendors, you need to be doing a conservation, if you're doing a conservation program on your lands, you will get more points in our choosing you as a vendor than if you were not. So they're showing that they value biodiversity, which is a change for most companies, to be thinking about that and to actually be using it as a lever. So that's one thing, is to integrate it with something they're already doing. The other one is integrated with something they're already reporting into. So most people in this room hopefully will have heard of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These set of goals are designed to make the world a more prosperous, healthy place to live. The goals are by design broad. They're by design vague, because they really want to try and engage every level of life in them. They superseded the Millennial Development Goals, which were focused on national governments. These are designed for local governments, state governments, private entities, non-profits to get involved with. This was a graphic we developed to show how conservation can support most of the Sustainability Development Goals. So when we look at life on land, that's obvious. That's obvious that, biodiversity programs can support goal number 15. But then when we look at other things like accessible food, of course conservation and better practices can support achievements towards those goals too. So of all of the Sustainable Development Goals, we can actually show the companies where conservation action, if they design them in the right way, can help them as they're trying to report on their progress to those goals. And all of these companies report. 98% of companies today, of large companies, mid and large companies, are creating some sort of corporate social responsibility report. These reports are verified by external auditors. They're assessed by their stakeholders and shareholders. They've become very important things for companies to sell what they're doing and to show what they're doing beyond their bottom line. So when you can help a company align with its reporting activities, you're providing them with value. So when you come and talk to companies about conservation, ask them what are they reporting into, and show them how the work that they can do within the pollinator sphere can help them report into one of the SDGs or the other reporting activities that companies do. And climate change is the other one. So climate change and the corporate world is a crazy place. That's why this graphic is a crazy graphic. Most companies that we work with are taking very serious, very high value action in developing products and processes for a carbon neutral future. Most companies have very ambitious goals for 2025 and 2030 with respect to climate change. They're looking at greenhouse gas reductions in what they're producing and in how what they're producing are being used by the people. So there's a very big and complex world in there. But there's an amazingly simple part of this world where companies can make a big difference, and that's in nature-based solutions for climate. So we're pushing companies, we just launched an initiative a couple of weeks ago called Climate Action Works, to think about their lands within a climate scenario for both GHG reduction, but also for community adaptation and resilience. Every company is in a community. Every company is in a city or a town that is trying to do an adaptation project or a resilience project, or has a goal, like a canopy cover goal. So companies, when they view themselves in that framework, can take action. So another way in and talking to communities is, what are you doing for climate? What are you doing in those areas, and how are you viewing your lands? From your corporate campus of that expansive and expensive lawn cover, I mean, could you imagine every corporate campus in the world having like a carbon meadow in it? It may not have a huge GHG reduction, but the actual psychological impact of that to the employees and the community would be huge. If every oil company who had remediation sites around the world decided to reforest those sites, that would be a very big and substantial impact instead of trying to monetize those sites. There's so much that companies can do when you can connect them into the climate. And their climate work is being driven by investors, it's being driven by financial institutions, and it's being driven by activist stakeholders. So thinking about what's driving them to take the actions that they're doing, those actions that are beyond the bottom line, are a really good way of thinking about how the corporate world works. Now, I risk my head in a room full of scientists saying that you don't need a diploma for anything, but this is one of my favorite quotes from Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai from Kenya. And it's kind of a reminder to us all, especially when we work with the corporate world, is you don't need a diploma to plant a tree. We have seen again and again where our companies interact with an NGO or maybe even a government agency, and they just get so confused because all they want to do is take the action and be told what they should be doing. And also, you don't need a diploma to plant a tree. It reminds us of the human dimension of everything that we do. So companies are made up of employees. Companies are made up of people. And people like to do something good. Many of you are probably aware of the anxiety around climate change and the biodiversity crisis. Most of us are suffering from that at the moment. So allowing people with the opportunity to take action on the lands in which they work and to feel pride in the companies in which they work is cannot be understated, the impact of that. So when we look at, this is Fiat Chrysler. This is a group of employees, too many employees, out planting a pollinator garden in Auburn Hills, and Fiat Chrysler's headquarters in Auburn Hills. It's the largest building in the United States after the Pentagon, so the building itself is humongous. The land around it is huge. It's mostly carpeted and lovely grass. But slowly but surely, they're engaging their employees and they're transitioning a lot of their lands into pollinator gardens. A very simple act for these people to take, but every time they have a planting, every time they have an engagement, they get more employees signed up because these employees feel like they can take action and do something. And at the other end of the spectrum, this is in Indonesia, where Freeport-McMoRan, the mining giant, is investing as part of their social license to operate, and their regulated license to operate, in mangrove restoration in the country. And they're engaging indigenous communities in training them to do the work and to do the work as part of their community connection. So these human dimensions, when we get into our science heads and our policy heads and our advocacy heads, the human dimensions can sometimes get forgotten. But it's actually the human dimensions that do make the big difference. And for companies, employee engagement is a big, big driver for them. It's a very competitive hiring market at the moment. If you go to any corporate sort of conference, they're talking about how they cannot get employees. So they're doing everything they can to up their employee engagement scores, whether internally or externally, to be seen as a good place to work. So this is another really powerful driver for corporate action on conservation. And again, pollinator efforts are one of the places, they're kind of like a gateway drug that allow them to start, and then they can see the benefits of it and continue it and make it larger and make it larger every year. So when we think about it, I'm going back to the piping clover now. We think about a steel mill. We think about the other broken places that we have all over this world. We think about the quarries, the landfills, the former industrial sites. We think about former gas stations. We think about those places, and that's where corporate conservation can make a huge difference. This picture is a landfill, obviously, in the background, but it's also a wetland that was created as part of capping and closing that landfill. And this actually is one of my favorite landfills. I have a favorite landfill, that's weird. But it's in Pennsylvania, and there's a couple of cool things about this, waste management. So one, it's one of the largest landfills in the East Coast. And when waste management came to open a new cell, they have to open it up for public comment. It's in a very affluent, very engaged, very educated area. They opened it up for comments to get a license to open a new cell. They received 0 negative comments from the community. The other thing is they've actually created a recreational village at the base of this landfill where people will come with their caravans or their mobile homes or build little cabins and go fishing. They have a waiting list of like 5 years to get into this recreational village at the base of a landfill. So it's really about thinking about things in different ways. And the last time I was there, it was buzzing again with pollinators. There was, you know, herons all over the place. It's just a really, really interesting landfill. So I'm going to say I wrote a book about this, just in case anybody wants to find out about those steps, because these are the steps that we need to take to engage companies in actual pragmatic and affordable and accessible and human dimension-based conservation. There's a Wildlife Habitat Council has been doing this for 30 years, and we've really refined our approaches, and we understand what drives the corporate world. So what I've done in the book is try to outline some of the things I just talked about here, how to identify the opportunities and the business drivers, how to create a plan with companies. The most important one is there will be disruption. The corporate world is portrayed in the media as being this slick, efficient method of operation. When you work with the corporate world, you realize it's the exact opposite. It's slow, it's clunky, it's continually in disruption. So when they diss the federal government, I'm like, really? You really need to look for yourself, because there are mergers, there are acquisitions, there's downturns, there's upturns, there's budget cycles, there's reorganizations, there's constant disruption in the corporate world. It's a very interesting place to work. But what we really think about is the power of a well-designed project, like how a project where a company is really thinking and understands its business need, connects its community, engages its employees, and has an absolutely fabulous biodiversity outcome. The power of that across a number of sectors can, again, never be understated. And our mantra is that every act of conservation matters. You know, we don't need tens of thousands of hectares. We like to have those projects with Wildlife Habitat Council, but every act, just getting out there, getting that tree in the ground, getting that plant in the ground, every act of conservation actually matters. So that's all I have to say to you today. Thank you very much.